Glad the music stopped just in time. I'm Ian Wardropper, director of the Frick Collection. Pleased to have you all come out on this rainy night to hear the lecture by Xavier Salomon titled Travels with Cagnacci. Xavier, who is the Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection, began his post here in 2014, but I like to think that he was destined for the job. Born in Rome, he took his PhD at the Courtauld Institute of Art, University of London, with a thesis on the religious, artistic, and architectural patronage of Cardinal Pietro Aldobrandini. He finished his thesis while he was Andrew W. Mellon Curatorial Fellow at the Frick between 2004-2006. This program is now called the Anne L. Poulet Fellows. While he was at the Frick, he curated the exhibition Veronese's Allegories, Virtue, Love, and Exploration in Renaissance Venice. Veronese would continue to be an abiding interest. He followed this fellowship by landing the position as Arturo and Holly Melosi Chief Curator at Dulwich Picture Gallery, London, which he held from 2006 to 2010. Among various projects at Dulwich, he did another exhibition on Van Dyck in Sicily, Painting in the Plague, which was held in 2012, as well as another exhibition involving the Frick, Masterpieces of European Painting from Dulwich Picture Gallery, which came here in 2010. From Dulwich, he moved to the Metropolitan Museum, where he was curator of Southern Baroque in the Department of European Paintings from 2011 to 2014. The year he moved to the Frick, he organized a third and the most important exhibition on Veronese, Veronese Magnificence in Renaissance Venice, for the National Gallery in London. The same year, he also curated the exhibition Goya and the Altamira Family for the Met, and started working on Andrea del Sarto, the Renaissance Workshop in Action, which he co-curated for the Getty and the Frick. This is just but a fraction of his activity during the period, which includes frequent articles and reviews for the Burlington magazine, where he's a trustee, and for Apollo magazine, among others. The whirlwind of activity that is Xavier Salomon descended on the Frick and has brought new energy to the curatorial department. Witness the host of exhibitions his colleagues have produced or are producing on Gouttiere, currently on view, Turner, which opens in February, and portrait medals from the Schur collection in May 2017, each organized by a different department curator to whom he has given enormous support and accompanied by inventive programs prepared by the Education Department. I will ignore the rest of his lengthy curriculum vitae with pages listing books, essays, articles, reviews, catalog entries, and lectures, and instead give you two illustrations of his character and interests. At the time of our exhibition of Coppel's Don Quixote tapestries, he started a book club to read all of Cervantes and cooked tortillas for all the participants. And for our ongoing project with the Ghetto Film School, he not only teaches up to 7 classes for honor students in film from a South Bronx high school, but will stay up dancing with them until 2 in the morning. I hope I've given you a portrait of a committed and engaged scholar, a dynamic and prolific curator, and an inspiring leader. When such a curator proposes to me that our latest exchange with the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena be an unusual choice, Guido Cagnacci's Repentant Magdalene, for which he would also write the first recent monograph in English, how could I say anything but yes? I will let Xavier tell you the rest of that story in his lecture, but I want to first remind you that the lecture is streamed live and will be archived on our website, and that for those of you in the audience here, the exhibition will be open for half an hour after the lecture. Xavier.
Thank you, Ian. I hope I'll be up to that introduction. When, in 1663, the news of the painter Guido Cagnacci's death in Vienna reached his hometown of Rimini, Monsignor Giacomo Villani eulogized his accomplishments in the city. He concluded by commenting that Cagnacci had been a painter of good talent, but of ill-fated fortune. Felicis ingenis pictor, sed infelicis fortune. Almost 400 years later, in October 1940, another Italian painter, Filippo de Pisis, wrote an article in the Bolognese newspaper Il Resto del Carlino about Cagnacci. In it, he stated that it is no exaggeration to say that there are a multitude of masters and minor masters of a glorious 17th and 18th centuries that time has in great part forgotten, and that modern art critics are now struggling to bring back to light. Cagnacci was, in the art historian Luisa Vertova's words, an uncultivated painter who succeeded in creating forceful images that are hard to forget. However, Cagnacci, with a few exceptions, was forgotten. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, he was hardly mentioned in the art historical literature, except by a small number of Italian authors. He was rediscovered in Italy in the 1950s through two exhibitions on Baroque art in Emilia-Romagna, one in Rimini in 1952, which focused on painters from Rimini in the 17th century, and another in Bologna on the broader topic of Emilian painting in the 17th century in 1959. Since then, an important monograph was written on the painter by Pier Giorgio Pasini in 1986, and Pasini has worked on the artist for most of his life, and I'm very indebted to his research for my work on him. And two major exhibitions have been devoted to Cagnacci in Italy, one in Rimini in 1993 and another one in Forlì in 2008. No exhibition has ever been organized on the artist outside of Italy. Cagnacci's Repentant Magdalene, an Italian Baroque masterpiece from the Norton Simon Museum, which is on view here at the Frick Collection until January 22nd and will then travel to the National Gallery in London, is a show around a single painting. But it is effectively the first exhibition devoted to Cagnacci to take place in both the United States and the United Kingdom. To accompany the exhibition, I wrote a book, The Art of Guido Cagnacci, which is not a comprehensive monograph on the painter, but was envisioned to introduce an artist who is little known, but deserves to be better known by an international audience. Most recently, Cagnacci's life has been described by the Italian art historian Daniele Benati as restless and dissolute, unruly and even disjointed. He was truly a nomadic and restless artist, whose career spanned 40 years across the 17th century, and who worked not only in his home region of Romagna, but also in the great centers of Italian Baroque art, Rome, Bologna, and Venice, and died at the imperial court of Vienna. Too much of our conception of Italian Baroque art is based on what happened in Rome, Bologna, and Naples, and we often do not take into account the complex developments on the rest of the Italian peninsula. Cagnacci is too often viewed as a provincial artist, and therefore minor. It is, I would argue, the very flavor of these provinces, regions such as Romagna, but also Liguria, the Marche, Piemonte, and Sicily, among many, that must be taken into to fully understand the Italian artistic scene of that century. To understand Cagnacci's art, we need to travel, not only to Bologna, Rome, Venice, and Vienna, but also to towns like Rimini, Forlì, and Faenza, and to villages such as Sant'Arcangelo, Salud, Hecho, and Monte Gridolfo. In 2015, I spent several weeks traveling in the footsteps of Cagnacci, mainly in Italy, to see his works, but also to understand where he came from and explore the places he lived and worked in. This lecture, therefore, is partly an art historical examination of Cagnacci's life and career, but also a quirky travelogue following him across Italy and Europe, between his birth in 1601 and his death in 1663. Most of my travels in Romagna took place in the summer of 2015, when, accompanied by a philosopher who had no idea who Cagnacci was before the trip, I traveled by car across that region. Romagna is the geographical area that you see on this map in northeastern Italy, between the Apennine Mountains and the Adriatic Sea, part of what is today known as Emilia-Romagna. This fertile area of the Po Valley had been under papal rule since the 13th century. And even though families, such as the Malatesta and Rimini, for example, had ruled certain areas of Romagna during the Renaissance, by the 17th century the region was under firm papal control. The main cities of Romagna are Ravenna, Rimini, Cesena, Faenza, and Forlì. and Cagnacci lived and was active in many of those centers. The small car traveling up and down Romagna during that summer had a third unlikely passenger, one long dead but still very much alive in my mind, Niccolò Paganini. And this is why the music was playing at the beginning. Over that summer, I became obsessed with his violin concerto number 4 in D minor, recorded with his own violin, known for its musical power as Il Cannone, the cannon, which is still kept in Genova, and played by Massimo Quarta. That piece of music became in my mind the soundtrack of my trip, and I think if there was ever a Cagnacci film, I hope that will be the soundtrack. I spent many hours driving from and back to Rimini along the coast and inland towards the Appennini, listening to Paganini. Some of the command and idiosyncrasy of his music captures, by chance, the character of Cagnacci's paintings. Even though Cagnacci and Paganini lived centuries apart and knew nothing of each other, their art and music somehow became inextricably linked in my mind. Guido Cagnacci was born on January 13th, 1601, in the small town of Sant'Arcangelo di Romagna. He was the son of Messer Matteo Cagnacci from Casteldurante, currently living in Sant'Arcangelo, and of Madonna Livia, his wife. The Cagnacci family was originally from Casteldurante, but Matteo had moved to Sant'Arcangelo, about 5 miles west of Rimini, in 1594. He was a town crier and a messenger, but was also active as a tanner, furrier, and hide merchant. His wife, Livia Serra, Guido's mother, was the daughter of another town crier from Cesena called Carlo. The boy Guido was their first child and was baptized on January 20th in the Pieve of San Michele by the parish priest Sebastiano Moretti. Guido was followed by 2 sisters, Lucia and Virginia, who were born in the following years. We don't know exactly where Guido was born. All of the many houses in which he lived over the years have either been destroyed or have not been identified. Just a small monument has been erected in Sant'Arcangelo, pointing out that he was born in a house in that town, but we don't know which, non si sa quale. Incidentally, the still life that was used to illustrate this picturesque monument, long attributed to Cagnacci, is not by the painter. Out of all the masterpieces he produced, Cagnacci is remembered in his hometown of Sant'Arcangelo by a painting he never painted. Guido grew up in the town, and we don't know much about his education, except from the fact that he must have trained there with a local artist as a boy. By 1618, Cagnacci was in Bologna. We know that he lived there in the house of a business partner of his father, Matteo Cagnacci, called Girolamo Leoni, in the parish of San Martino Maggiore, and his studies were paid at the time by his father. Here he probably worked in the workshop of the painter Ludovico Carracci. Matteo Cagnacci must have envisioned an outstanding training for his son. Not only he was based in Bologna, with one of the best painters at the time, but he traveled twice, between 1618 and 1620, to Rome. On Easter Day, 1622, we know that Cagnacci was living with the painter Guercino in his house on the Strada Paolina, today's Via del Babbuino. At this time, Guercino was at work on his massive altarpiece of the burial of Saint Petronilla for St. Peter's, and it is possible that Cagnacci helped the master with it as a workshop assistant or even as a younger colleague. At that point, he was already in his early 20s. Both Bologna and Rome would have afforded Cagnacci access to the most important works being produced by fellow painters at the time. And it is clear that the art of Carracci and Guercino, among many others, provided a lasting influence on him and his work. Back in Romagna, the 20-year-old Guido started to paint independently. His early career as an artist is still highly problematic, and scholars still debate many of the attributions and dates from this period. Most of his works were ecclesiastical commission for local churches. One of the very first ones was the high altar of the very small oratory of San Rocco at Monte Gridolfo, on the border between Romagna and the Marche. When I traveled to Monte Gridolfo, and this became a constant theme of my trip, I found the church closed. Most of these churches do remain locked, except from Sundays, for security reasons and for lack of staff. I have to say, however, that for each church, the doors of which I found closed, I also always found someone who had keys and could grant access. I'm still hugely grateful to the old lady who lives across the street from San Rocco and who, after I rang her doorbell, came down with keys to open the tiny church. The altarpiece, with the Virgin and Child with Saint Sebastian, Rock, and Hyacinth, was probably painted in the first half of the 1620s and is one of the earliest known works by Cagnacci. The iconography of the painting, with the Virgin surrounded by the two plague saints, Sebastian and Rock, had already been established in the church and replaced an earlier fresco, which is still preserved in the church. And you see here the earlier fresco with the Virgin and Child, Saint Roch and Sebastian, and in the final altarpiece, again, the Virgin and Child, Sebastian, Roch. The addition of Hyacinth, which is not altogether, hasn't been explained altogether satisfactorily, but it's probably the local priest or the patron was called Giacinto, something like that, and that probably explains why he's there. This is still a juvenile work, and its composition does not altogether function in a very satisfactory manner. It almost reads like four groups of separate figures that have all been jumbled together in an altarpiece. Cagnacci's first documented work was painted instead for another small town in southeastern Romagna, Salud, which is halfway between Rimini and Urbino, and not far away from Monte Gridolfo. Many of Cagnacci's early paintings are often still preserved in the churches they were painted for, but many of these buildings have, however, been substantially transformed, mostly in the 18th and 19th centuries, and with the exception of the little church that I've just shown you in Monte Gridolfo, Cagnacci would have not recognized many of the places, now much grander and differently decorated. And this is the reconstructed church in Salud, which would have looked very different in the 17th century. This is mostly 18th century reconstruction. On September 8th, in Salud, Cagnacci's painting has actually been moved out of the church and into the small local museum, which is just adjacent to the church. On September 8th, 1627, the Confraternity of the Holy Sacrament in Salud commissioned Cagnacci to decorate its chapel in the parish church of San Biagio. Guido was paid between September 1627 and April 1628, and for part of that time he lived in the town of Salud to carry out the commission. The original plan for the chapel must have consisted of at least two paintings, but only one survives. The chapel, originally built between 1626 and 1627, was demolished with the parish church in 1794 and entirely rebuilt. The procession of the Holy Sacrament is all that survives of this commission, and it depicts a pope holding the Holy Sacrament and walking in procession with deacons. And you see the pope here, and there's a deacon at the front holding a tiara, which identifies the priest as a pope. This may refer probably to a specific historical event, and that would be the passage of Pope Julius II through Salud in the spring of 1507. It seems that for most of the 1620s, Cagnacci was based in Rimini. In the Salud contract of 1627, he is referred to as Guido Cagnacci, painter of Rimini, Guido Cagnacci, pittore di Rimini. Rimini is known today as one of the prime summer destinations on the Adriatic coast, a city that is mainly celebrated for its beaches and discos. The city, however, was founded in the 3rd century BC, where the river Marecchia enters the Adriatic, and as the ancient Roman city of Ariminum, it was one of the major harbors of the area. Roman ruins, such as the Arch of Augustus and the Bridge of Tiberius, were celebrated in the 17th century as remains of Rimini's ancient history. For almost 300 years, from the mid-13th to the early 16th century, Rimini was under the rule of the Malatesta family, who left important examples of their patronage, such as, of course, the Church of San Francesco, known as the Tempio Malatestiano, rebuilt around 1450 after designs by Leon Battista Alberti. In Cagnacci's time, Rimini was under papal rule and has memorably been described by the Italian art historian Francesco Arcangeli as our own little Seville. Cagnacci appears in 1628 in Rimini, but this time not in a document recording an artistic commission, but in the criminal records of the city. In the late 1620s, the painter had begun a relationship with an aristocratic widow, Teodora Arianna Stivivi, who had been married to the much older Battaglino Battaglini, who had died in 1625, soon followed to the grave by the two sons that they had together. After a first affair with Gianpaolo Segantini, Teodora began a liaison with Cagnacci. The two made an official promise to marry on October 20th, 1628, in front of two witnesses. However, her father and her family, no doubt to control the substantial money she had inherited, were against the union. Guido and Teodora eloped. They left her palace in Rimini with her daughter and a servant named Filomena at night, and at first took refuge in the house of Cagnacci's father, in the Contrada of Sant'Agostino, where they remained for 2 days and nights. While Guido went to Sant'Arcangelo to procure horses with which they planned to leave Rimini, the Stivivi family had denounced the fact to the authorities, and Teodora moved, with Cagnacci's mother Livia, to hide in a house in Borgo San Bartolomeo. In attempting to save his son, Matteo Cagnacci denounced Teodora's hiding place to the Bishop of Rimini, and she was arrested in that house at night, dressed in red as a man. While Teodora was imprisoned in the convent of the Convertite, a place where fallen women were housed, Guido took refuge in the church of San Giovanni Battista, and then left Rimini. Several years later, in March 1632, he was still officially demanding Teodora's dowry from her family. But he was never granted it, and in the same year, Teodora was forced to marry her nephew, Vincenzo Ricciardelli, in a successful attempt by the Stivivi and Battaglini families to control her dowry. For about 3 years, Cagnacci lived away from Rimini, we don't know where, and around 1630, he must have returned to the city to paint the most successful altarpiece of his early career, the Virgin and Child with 3 Carmelite saints, Teresa of Avila, Maria Maddalena de' Pazzi, and Andrea Corsini, for the Church of San Giovanni Battista, the same church he had taken refuge in at the time of the elopement. He may have taken refuge in the church because he already knew the Carmelite priests there, and maybe the commission of the altarpiece even predated the Stivivi affair. In the paintings, all 3 saints had been recently canonized. Teresa of Avila in 1622, Maria Maddalena de' Pazzi in 1626, and Andrea Corsini as recently as 1629. This large canvas is divided into 3 harmoniously balanced narratives. At the top, the Virgin and Child appear to Saint Andrea Corsini, while the 2 female saints at the bottom are visited by celestial creatures. On the left, an angel pierces Teresa's heart with an arrow, as recounted by the saint in her own memoirs. And on the right, Maria Maddalena de' Pazzi holds a piece of Eucharistic bread while an angel crowns her with thorns. Bathed in livid light, the entire scene is one of the most dramatic ever conceived by Cagnacci. It is a claustrophobic yet deeply felt creation, with angels with androgynous faces and outrageously long wings. It is the moment, really, when Cagnacci's talent begins to shine. Only a few years later, in August 1634, the Compagnia of the Carpenters and Blacksmiths of Cagnacci's birthplace, Sant'Arcangelo, commissioned Guido to paint an altarpiece with their 2 patron saints, Joseph and Eligio, for their chapel in Santa Croce. The canvas has since been moved and is now in the church where Cagnacci was baptized in 1601, which you saw earlier, and it remains the only work by the painter in his birthplace. Following the failed elopement with Teodora Arianna Stivivi, Cagnacci seems to have had another relationship with a woman named Giovanna, the daughter of Sebastiano, a mason from Serravalle. On April 5th, 1636, in the presence of a notary and witnesses, and Cagnacci himself, Giovanna signed a document in Rimini that granted all of her belongings to the artist with no explanation. She retained only a small income for her maintenance and asked the painter to pay for masses in her memory after her death. We don't know if Giovanna was somewhat related to Cagnacci or if she was his lover. In any case, this is the last document to link the painter to Rimini, and he must have left the city soon after to seek his fortune elsewhere. At the end of the 1630s, Cagnacci painted an altarpiece for the town from which his family originated, Casteldurante. After the death of the last Duke of Urbino, Francesco Maria II della Rovere, in 1631, the city had been reclaimed by the Papal States. And in 1636, it was renamed Urbania in honor of Pope Urban VIII. On December 6, 1637, the Benedictine nuns of the newly named Urbania paid 56 scudi to the painter. This was for the altar of the small church of Santa Maria Maddalena, which is still run by Benedictine nuns who live in a nearby enclosed convent. And again, getting into the church is not easy. The Penitent Magdalene is an unexpected painting in Cagnacci's oeuvre. It marks the beginning of an altogether different trajectory and artistic language, a world away from the Carmelite altarpiece I showed you earlier. An art historian aptly commented, "The Magdalene, apparently transfigured, is only ecstatic in a physical ecstasy, of an almost Zola-like evidence, to the point that those tears in her eyes give an almost odious emphasis to her repentance." After a brief period back in Bologna, Cagnacci moved to Forlì, a city southeast of Bologna, halfway between Bologna and Rimini. His move there, about 1641, was most likely because of patronage opportunities in the city. One of the works painted in these years is the St. Anthony of Padua preaching, created for the altar of the Morattini family in the Cathedral of Forlì. The saint is shown in the altarpiece preaching, presumably on the subject of the Trinity, as his fingers seem to suggest. The saint was said to have begun his preaching career in Forlì, so this was an appropriate subject for a painting for the city. When Count Algarotti saw the painting in 1761, he remarked that the canvas was an object of such truth and simplicity that you just fall in love with it. While in Forlì, Cagnacci received one of the most important commissions of his life. On the night of February 4th, 1428, a fire destroyed a school in the center of Forlì. Once the flames were extinguished, it was found that a woodcut on paper, representing the Virgin and Child surrounded by saints, had miraculously survived the fire and was intact on a standing wall. The image was solemnly brought to the cathedral, where it is still known as the Madonna del Fuoco, the Madonna of the Fire, and is the most important sacred image of the city. Between 1619 and 1636, a new chapel was built to house the image, attached to the left nave of the cathedral. The building was inaugurated in October 1636. For the procession that brought the Madonna del Fuoco to its new chapel, two of the confraternities of the city, the Battuti Bianchi and the Battuti Bigi, the different confraternities were named according to the color of the clothes, so these were the white and gray ones, there were also green, red, and blue ones, commissioned two large standards from Francesco Albani and from Andrea Sacchi, representing their patron saints, Saint Sebastian on the left and Saint Peter on the right. In 1642, the group of people in charge of the decoration of the chapel, who were known as the Fabbricieri, decided to decorate the dome of the chapel. They established that the two standards by Albani and Sacchi should be placed in the octagonal drum of the dome. So the idea was to place them, you had the four windows, and where these four sculptures are, they would place two of the paintings, the Sacchi and the Albani. And to match them, they asked Cagnacci to produce two more quadroni, large paintings, representing two more saints, the patron saints of Forlì. Valeriano, who was a Roman soldier from Forlì, who was martyred with 80 companions, and Mercuriale, a 4th century saint, believed to have been the first bishop of Forlì, and who was said to have delivered the city from a dragon by placing his stole over its neck. It is clear from the contract that the Fabbricieri expected Cagnacci to paint two large single figures, not dissimilar from the ones by Albani and Sacchi. Once the two canvases were completed, they stipulated that Cagnacci should fresco the dome with an Assumption of the Virgin. The Fabbricieri did not get what they were expecting. The execution of the canvases was delayed, and finally Cagnacci delivered the most ambitious compositions he had created so far. At the center of both canvases are the two saints. Valeriano and Mercuriale with the stole over the dragon, and of course Valeriano dressed as a soldier. But they're surrounded by several other figures and angels set against limpid blue skies. In the upper register are figures that would be identified as angels were it not for the fact that most of them don't have wings. Francesco Arcangeli in 1959 poetically and memorably commented on the painting. Look at those deacons, at those altar boys, how they are still so modern, mocking, melancholy, provocative youths, with those shirts like Russian peasants or cyclists, and those angels, how they fly, rotating more swiftly, more slowly, as if Cagnacci had studied from life the dives and immersions of swimmers in the harbor of his own Rimini. The paintings remained in the drum of the chapel of the Madonna del Fuoco for slightly more than 50 years, and they must have been a very odd sight to see. Imagine these in comparison with the other two. In 1699, not surprisingly, they were removed and placed somewhere else in the cathedral and eventually substituted by those sculptures. In 1851, they were moved to the local Pinacoteca, where they still tower over the empty and eerie Salone of the Palazzo del Merenda. And here you see the juxtaposition between Cagnacci's quadroni and the Sacchi and Albania cross, and you see how different they are. The museum is currently, of course, unfortunately closed for lack of staff, and it has been for years. And it was only thanks to a very kind guard that I managed to spend some time with Cagnacci's masterpieces. And it is amazing to think that these are amongst the greatest works in Forlì, and they're totally unavailable to the public. Another art historian, Cesare Ignudi, writing about the Quadroni in 1952, commented about the place where that sensuous atmosphere is densest, heavier, and more material, but exceeded and poetically expressed in the richness of a soft song, replete with an exuberant languor, almost the lushness, slightly weighty and sultry, of a summer that is too ripe. Once the two canvases were completed, however, Cagnacci's work on the project came to a halt. He may have been daunted by the frescoing of the entire dome, and after all, he had never and would never paint in fresco. He either willingly left Forlì or the Fabbricieri dismissed him. Documents from a few years later imply that Cagnacci was fired. The painter seems to have been already well known for his eccentric behavior. In 1741, Giampietro Zanotti recorded in a letter to Giambattista Costa, "When I was young, I met some old people who had been friends of Cagnacci's, and they told me that he always traveled with a young girl disguised as a man, and that he claimed she was his servant. And they told me that he modeled the women he painted on her." In January 1643, Matteo Cagnacci, Guido's father, wrote his will in Rimini. He left his belongings to his daughters, Lucia and Virginia, leaving Guido only his legitimate part, from which all the expenses covered by Matteo for his son's artistic education were detracted. It seems that Matteo was unhappy with his son, and the relationship between the two must have been at least strained since Matteo revealed Teodora's hiding place to the authorities during the Stivivi elopement case in 1628. Matteo must have been so bitter that out of the expenses detracted from Guido's inheritance, he included also 4 bed sheets and other household linen that the said Messer Guido took from the house of Messer Matteo, his father, without his consent, and took with him to Salud Hecho. In these years, Cagnacci traveled around Romagna and worked also in Faenza and Cesena. Around this time in the 1640s, he started to paint compositions of the type he would become most celebrated for. The beautiful Cleopatra, recently acquired by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, is among the earliest examples of these half-length, provocative paintings. In this picture, the colors are subdued and beautifully balanced. The color of the textiles echo other parts of the painting, the dress resonating with the flushed flesh of the queen with her half-open lips, the shirt picking up the translucent white of her pearl earrings. In the late 1640s, Cagnacci moved again, this time to Venice. Around 1649, he established his workshop in the parish of San Giovanni Crisostomo. More than 10 years later, in 1661, a Sicilian painter named Giuseppe Bonanni, who identified himself as a pupil of Cagnacci's, made a deposition with regards to yet another woman from Cesena named Maddalena, the daughter of Domenico Fontana Fredda. Bonanni recalled that about 12 years ago, when I used to go and study in the house of Signor Guido Cagnacci, the painter, near San Giovanni Crisostomo, where she lived, after I met her, she has always lived in Venice in the said house, and in another one nearby, up until 2.5 years ago, more or less, when she left with the same Signor Guido and never returned. We don't know who Maddalena Fontana Fredda was, or why the authorities were looking for her. But by 1661, it seems that she had left Venice together with Cagnacci. It sounds like she was one of the women dressed up as men that he kept in the workshop, a model, possibly a companion or a lover. Cagnacci must have moved to Venice to start a new life, away from the Papal States and his native Romagna. Venice, of course, as one of the great Italian artistic centers and as a city known for its freedom, especially in terms of matters of morality, must have greatly appealed to Cagnacci. He was moving away from a world firmly rooted under papal authority and effectively run by ecclesiastical powers to a secular republic that took pride in its detachment from Rome. The libertine tolerance of Venice had been one of the main reasons why foreigners were attracted to the city. Another interesting aspect of Cagnacci's stay in Venice is revealed in a letter from Giovan Battista Costa to Giampietro Zanotti of August 25, 1742. A certain Antonio Baldini from Sant'Arcangelo had given him information about Cagnacci, who was a friend of his maternal uncle. According to Baldini, his uncle and someone called Niccolò Bartoli went to Venice for pleasure around the year 1650. And at that time, the painter Guido lived there. And wanting to go and visit him as a compatriot, it took them a while to find the house in which he lived. Having found it, they asked for Signor Guido Cagnacci from Sant'Arcangelo. And a group of young pupils answered that this was the house of Signor Canlassi, a painter from Bologna, and not Signor Cagnacci from Sant'Arcangelo. Therefore, believing to have been mistaken, as they were leaving, Guido returned home, and having been out, they recognized him for the real Cagnacci. It transpires that with his move to Venice, Cagnacci attempted to forge a new persona, away from his past in Romagna. During his sojourn in the city, he signed his letters Guidobaldo Canlassi. Yet all his paintings from this period are signed Guido Cagnacci, so slightly puzzling way of hiding away from people. Cagnacci lived in Venice for almost 10 years, and there he produced mostly half-length figures for a private clientele. Cagnacci's contemporaries were highly critical of his almost industrial production of such paintings. The Rape of Europa is one of these Venetian pictures that would have surely been appreciated by a male audience, and not just for its artistic merits. The visual center of the composition is clearly Europa's breasts, which she brazenly displays to the viewer. Even though her pose, with her right arm raised to her head, may have been based on ancient statuary, one cannot help thinking of this Europa, hardly distraught by her abduction, as a modern pin-up girl fresh out of the pages of a 1980s Playboy magazine. The Venetian art critic Marco Boschini, in his celebrated text, La Carta del Navegar Pittoresco of 1661, criticized those painters who are so miserable in their design and so feeble in finding an invention, and mentioned painters who are also bad dogs. And of course, this is a play on the word Cagnacci, which in Italian means bad dogs. And with clear allusions to Cagnacci, he critiqued those painters who constantly produce half-length of nude women. For example, he will paint in a polished manner a half-figure of a nude Susanna. By adding 2 doves, he will transform her in the fine-looking goddess of beauty. And because it seems to him to be sweet and good, by adding one of those flowers which with a blow of the breath vanishes, among them he consoles and nourishes himself by saying, "Now she is human life." And if by chance he feels like transforming her into some other figure, he carefully and judiciously paints a vase in her hands, and there she becomes Mary Magdalene. Cagnacci, not surprisingly, displayed a particular loathing against Boschini and referred to his book in a letter to one of his pupils as paper to wrap fish in at the market, un libro da sardelloni. Boschini in his text singled out paintings that represented allegories of human life, which seemed to have been a specialty of Cagnacci's in the 1650s, and exist in a number of versions, mainly following these two prototypes. The one on the left in a private collection here in America, the one on the right in the collection of Vittorio Sgarbi in Italy. These nude women, accompanied by the attributes of roses, dandelions in full bloom, these are the flowers that Boschini refers to, one of those flowers which with the blow of a breath vanishes, candles on the verge of extinction, one here and a group there, hourglasses and skulls, were clearly vanitas paintings, pointing out the inevitable passing of time and the fading of beauty. Of course, by acquiring paintings such as these, the collectors could be sure that at least the incendiary sensual beauty of Cagnacci's works was not to fade. During the period Cagnacci spent in Venice, he struggled not only with critics, but also with contemporary painters, in particular with Pietro Liberi, who quickly became his principal rival and enemy in the city. In July 1658, the 18-year-old Leopold I was crowned emperor in Vienna. It was probably the young emperor's uncle, the Archduke Leopold Wilhelm, who invited Cagnacci to move to Vienna. And here you see the emperor in a probably unfinished portrait. I think the armor was probably actually painted in by someone else, and the background is somewhat unfinished, which was painted during the time in Vienna and belongs to the Kunsthistorische Museum, but it's on loan to Ambras, Schloss Ambras in Austria. Archduke Leopold Wilhelm was a well-known art lover and had amassed a great collection of Venetian paintings in the previous decades. A taste for Venetian art was firmly established at the imperial court, and Cagnacci was probably eagerly looking for more prominent patrons. Unfortunately for him, the other painter who was invited and moved to Vienna at the same time was Pietro Liberi. We don't know much about Cagnacci's Viennese stay, but a few letters give us a glimpse into his life at the time. It is clear that his all-consuming hatred for Liberi was fueled by his move to Vienna. Commenting on a painting of virtue banishing vice that Liberi had just painted for the court, Cagnacci bitterly remarked, "For me, there is nothing good in it, and it would be worth a lot more if the canvas was blank." Following in the footsteps of what he had already produced in Vienna, Cagnacci created a series of single half-length figures in Vienna. One of his most famous ones was his Cleopatra, which was one of the paintings exhibited in 1959 for the first time, which made intellectuals rediscover Cagnacci in Italy. In terms of Cagnacci's single figures, this can easily be described as his masterpiece, and as the one work in which the sensuality that he always displayed in his paintings reached an unsurpassed height. This could be a room with empty walls, as well as a photographer's studio where the model is placed in front of a neutral background. Cagnacci deliberately gives the viewer no clue as to where we are in space and time. The focus is entirely on the Egyptian queen, slumped in a 17th century chair, upholstered in red velvet or maybe leather. Wrapped around one of the chair's armrests is a small snake, lodged beneath the girl's arm. And it's kind of difficult to see. This is the only attribute that helps us define the figure as Cleopatra. She could be asleep or fainting, but something in her expression betrays a certain erotic connotation. Like many 17th century female saints, Teresa of Avila above all, her ecstatic expression is on the threshold between the divine and the earthly. Ecstasies experienced by saints often look remarkably like more human sexual experiences. Cagnacci's Cleopatra is captured in an almost post-coital rapture, and her expression remains a deeply puzzling one, and one that is still open to different types of interpretation. In the sharp focus on the single female figure, Cagnacci reaches a sensibility that is almost 19th century in character, and the painting has often been compared, reasonably, to work by modern artists, even to Manet and Renoir. When, in 1960, the painting was acquired by Alberto Saibene, a Milanese collector, he immediately gave the canvas to the Pinacoteca di Brera in Milan, where it still is today. A family rumor suggests that Saibene donated the Cagnacci to the museum not only because of civic liberality, but because his wife, Carla, considered the painting inappropriate for the home of a respectable bourgeois family in Milan. This seems to have been a standard response to Cagnacci's art. In 1741, the painter Giampietro Zanotti wrote about a painting by Cagnacci which belonged to a Bolognese senator, Ghislieri, but because of some qualms, he deprived himself of it. In her unapologetic sensual authority, Cagnacci's Cleopatra prefigures other powerful female figures created centuries later by another man from Romagna, the film director Federico Fellini, who was born in Rimini in 1920. Fellini recalled his childhood in the city in the 1973 film Amarcord, which includes memorable female characters such as Gradisca and the Tabaccaia, grounded in their erotic power. In 1960, the same year Cagnacci's Cleopatra entered the collection of Brera, La Dolce Vita was released in cinemas. Anita Ekberg's stroll into the Trevi Fountain at night and the ecstatic pleasure it produced in her remains one of Fellini's most enduring images, one remarkably close in spirit to the Brera Cleopatra. During my stay in Rimini, in the evenings, after dinners by the sea, I would return to my room in the Grand Hotel, the fin de siècle establishment which inspired many of the scenes in Amarcord. And watching Fellini movies, I wondered if he was among the visitors of the 1959 exhibition in Bologna, and saw Cagnacci's Cleopatra there while he was filming La Dolce Vita. And maybe I'm just making this up, but I'm more convinced that he did. Incidentally, the fantastic Cleopatra will be here in New York starting at the end of this week from December 2nd, from Friday at the Italian Cultural Institute until January 19th. And I invite you all to go and see it because it will be a great opportunity to see it by itself at the just a few blocks away. In Vienna, Cagnacci painted a second canvas with the death of Cleopatra, most likely for Archduke Leopold Wilhelm, from whose collection the painting reached the Kunsthistorisches Museum. Technical analysis has proved that this painting was originally a canvas showing a single figure of Cleopatra, not dissimilar from the Brera one, and at a later stage, Cagnacci added 5 pieces of canvas at the sides and at the top, and painted the 6 additional figures. So all of this part here is added, and the whole side and that side are added. The composition must have therefore started as a variant of the Brera Cleopatra and was subsequently altered and enlarged. When in Vienna, Cagnacci became more ambitious in his art, leaving single half-length figures behind and developing a grander pictures for his imperial audience. Leopold Wilhelm owned a number of paintings by Cagnacci, but unfortunately for the painter, the Archduke died 2 years after he arrived in Vienna in 1662. With him, the painter lost one of the most important patrons he had ever had in his career, and this is the coffin of Archduke Leopold Wilhelm in the Capuchin crypt in Vienna, where the Habsburgs are buried. Yet, when the Archduke died, Cagnacci was at work on his final masterpiece, the painting with which he probably planned to stun the emperor and his court. When writing to his pupil Francesco Gionima in Venice in 1660-1661, explaining how unlikely it would be for him to visit Venice after Easter, Cagnacci was referring to this painting. I cannot come to Venice anymore after Easter because His Imperial Majesty has asked that I promise to make him a painting of the repentant St. Mary Magdalene with 4 full-length figures. Cagnacci then continued with his usual bitter sarcasm, describing how these 4 figures would be full length. And because I cannot paint feet, it would be better if Cavaliere Liberi could come himself and paint them. This was clearly the time for Cagnacci to prove himself, with a large religious image with multiple figures commissioned by the emperor. Not only Cagnacci proved he could indeed paint legs and feet, but with his Repentant Magdalene, he produced one of the most astonishing masterpieces of 17th-century Italian art. Cagnacci sets the scene in a large room, lit from a window on the left and from a door open to the right, which gives access to a balcony. The sky is visible from both window and door, and columns and a balustrade denote the house as an aristocratic residence. The house is richly decorated. An Eastern rug and 3 red and gold damask cushions show that this is a dwelling of a rich person, and presumably refer to biblical times and an Eastern exotic location. At the center of the composition on the floor is Mary Magdalene, her long blonde hair cascading at her side, her face reddened by grief, her body barely covered by a white sheet around her waist. She has cast her earthly belongings aside after her conversion to Christianity and her meeting with Christ in the temple. And her belongings are visible all over the floor of the room in an astonishing still life. On the left is the Magdalene's outfit, a rich blue and white dress, here, accompanied by an extraordinary pair of blue and gold shoes. The shoes alone give a clear impression of the elegance and wealth that Mary Magdalene must have enjoyed in a previous sinful life as a courtesan. An oval green box, here, with an embroidered decoration, lies open on the floor, its contents spilling out of the main part of the box, and the lid next to it, and by the side of the shoes, the jewels spill out. This is the Magdalene's jewel box, and all her precious belongings are spread on the floor. Gold necklaces and bracelets, rings with precious stones, and earrings are scattered on the tiles, and several pearl strings are bunched on the floor, down here. One of them has been ripped by Mary, probably as she forcefully removed it from her neck, down at the bottom, and the pearls are rolling into the viewer's space, one by one coming out of the thread. Only a gold chain remains in Mary's hands, tightly grasped in between her fingers and twisted around her right wrist as she holds it almost as a rosary. To the right of Mary is her sister Martha, beautifully and simply dressed in white and lilac. She has placed one of the cushions on the floor and she sits on it, consoling her sister. Behind them, 2 servants are leaving the room after having discovered their mistress in such state. One is wiping tears from her face. As they leave, the other is closing the doors. Martha is tenderly looking at Mary while she gestures towards the left, indicating another group of 2 figures. At the center of the painting, set against the black wall, is a standing angel, covered by a winding blue drapery, its hair blown by the divine wind that ruffles its evanescent wings. With a long rod, the angel banishes a levitating devil, complete with horns and tail, who approaches the window as he abandons the room. The 2 fighting figures clearly represent virtue, the angel, and vice, the devil, locked in combat as Mary chooses to follow her virtuous new Christian life. The combination of the narrative of the Magdalene's conversion with the allegorical figures of virtue and vice is an altogether new one, and a specific invention on Cagnacci's part. It cannot be a coincidence that the painter chose to sign the painting at the bottom right corner, down here, as Guido Cagnaccius Inventor, drawing attention to the compositional innovation and the invention in the painting, rather than Pinxit or Fecit. Unfortunately, there is no evidence as to how anyone in the 17th century responded to this fantastic painting. Even though it seems to have been painted for Leopold I, judging from the letter I quoted earlier, by 1665 the large canvas was in Italy, in the collection of Carlo II Gonzaga, the Duke of Mantua, at his villa of La Favorita, outside of Mantova, which is now in ruins. And the story of how to get into that villa is another long one that I'll keep for another time. The Gonzagas were related to the imperial family. Carlo II was married to Isabella Clara of Austria, the emperor's cousin, and Leopold I's stepmother was Eleonora Gonzaga, Carlo's sister, who had married in 1651 Emperor Ferdinand III. Cagnacci's canvas may have been ordered as a diplomatic gift from the emperor to the Duke of Mantua, or was possibly acquired by Gonzaga before 1665. And looking at this large room, you cannot help but notice that the size of this paneling is about the size of the Repentant Magdalene, and I wondered if it did hang on the upper story of this room or a similar room in the villa at the time. Cagnacci's stay in Vienna lasted less than 5 years. In 1663, the painter died in the city. We do not know what caused his death, but he was apparently buried in the Augustinerkirche in Vienna, the court church attached to the Hofburg imperial palace, which means he was considered at the time as somewhat of a court artist. No monument or inscription, however, records his exact burial place in the church. As namelessly as he was born in Sant'Arcangelo 62 years before, Cagnacci disappeared from the scenes in Vienna. No contemporary portrait of the artist is known. He left no will, and his sisters, Lucia and Virginia, inherited their brother's properties. And by 1667, they were still receiving part of this inheritance from Vienna. Lucia had died in 1665, and by the time Virginia died in 1689, she was the last member of the Cagnacci family, and not having any children herself, she asked to be buried next to her sister, who had also died without children, in the Theatine Church in Rimini, which is now in ruins, and left all of her belongings to the fathers of the church. This seems to be the end of the Cagnacci family as far as we know. Cagnacci left no followers or pupils to continue and promote his unique style. And this, among many other reasons, has consigned the artist's work to a relative oblivion in which it has languished until fairly recently. His contemporaries and subsequent historians found it difficult to describe him, and it was only starting in the 1950s that the artist's figure began to be better understood in Italy. Abroad, Cagnacci still deserves to be better known, and his extraordinary works merit to be better studied and appreciated. But Cagnacci was an astonishing and unusual 17th century artist. His main achievements rest in his uniqueness. He remains a distinctive, idiosyncratic, one-off painter in the broad landscape of Italian Baroque art. Giovanni Bianchi, in a letter of October 13, 1751 to Giambattista Costa, essentially and simply described the painter. For him, Cagnacci was a bizarre genius, un genio bizzarro. But the most accurate description of Cagnacci's art remains, for me, Cesare Nudi's portrayal of the large quadroni for the Cathedral of Forlì, a text that could as well be applied to the Norton Simon Repentant Magdalene. A sensuous beauty, an exuberant life that expands into a spectacular vision, a magnificent and joyful ballet, a world that delights itself in an enchanted game of brilliant colors, of dazzling lights, of sounds, and at the same time discovers a reality which is closer and more earthly, a new, much abbreviated relationship with nature. All of these, we have seen, are typical 17th century notes, but expressed in such singular form that it can be easily said that they add a new accent to the history of Italian painting. Thank you.